Hello and welcome back to Inside Update, a show brought to you by InsideInvestigator.org. We are a nonprofit newsroom where we create investigative journalism to root out corruption in Connecticut. My name is Connor Dragotis. I'm the managing editor here, and today I am joined by Ep40 to talk about her newest investigation. This one it's a hot topic. It's something that has been going on for years in the state of Connecticut against the backdrop of housing generally. But she took a deep dive on evictions. And the title of this investigation is Evicted: What Connecticut's Changing Eviction Laws Mean for Renters and Landlords. Alex, thank you for being here first.
Hi, thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Let's talk about this one because, like I said, hot button issue, long standing debate, some major players here. Tell us about your piece, and then we can get into some of the landscape stuff here as well.
Yeah, so my piece really looks at the process of eviction, which seems very vague, but it's actually a little more complicated than you'd think. And it looks at the process and it looks at the costs and all of the different variabilities that can change the eviction process for both tenants and landlords. If you hear the scratching, promise it's my dog, not a body. Um, anyway, but yeah, it's a focus on anyway, it's about the process of evictions, the costs of evictions, and what is being forward. Because one thing that, there are a few things that both landlords and tenants and people can agree on, but one of it is that we are in some sort of housing crisis. And I almost feel comfortable using that word because even when I spoke to people on both sides of the aisle, the word crisis came up. So it's just about this whole situation we've got here.
I think the specificity is a really good point to bring up because you got into something as specific as, you know, at each step of the process, how does this work? Who do you have to talk to? How much does it cost? I mean, the whole thing opens, hey, it's not cheap or quick to evict a tenant in Connecticut. It can take months and cost thousands of dollars, and fighting an eviction has a similar price tag. I also sympathize with what you're saying about maybe some hesitation to use the word crisis, because especially it seems in Connecticut, it's used pretty frequently. We got a trash crisis, we got a homelessness crisis, we got a fiscal budgetary crisis. I mean, yeah, I feel like I'm going to run out of fingers before I run out of crises in that people label in the state. Um, this one is, I guess, you say you feel more comfortable doing it. There is a human element here, right? We try to do journalism by humans for humans, and that we can talk about what that means from a journalistic standpoint a little later, but it does reference the fact that we are talking about a northeastern state where if you don't have a place to live, that gets very complicated, potentially life-threatening. What does that mean, I guess, crisis? Like what is missing, or what do people at least say is missing or needs to happen?
Um, to sum it up, it is places to live and, reliable people to rent to. Those are two different sides of it. Yeah, so you hear the word crisis a lot about a lot of different things. Certainly in the state, I should also note that I feel like every state in the union has some sort of housing crisis. I've lived in multiple parts of, New York, Connecticut, Oregon, Colorado, Alaska, Arizona. Every single state, blue, red, urban, rural, has some sort of housing crisis. So it's very easy to make these statements and just kind of let it blend in, or not blend in, but kind of like blend into the national backdrop. But in Connecticut, because it's a unique state, like every state, there are unique issues. Um, and in this case, there's really two sides of this. So from a landlord perspective, and this is actually how I started most of my reporting, I heard a lot from landlords that were very eager to talk. It's really hard to take care of your property. It's really hard to, if something goes wrong, it's hard to fix it. If a tenant doesn't pay rent, if something is destructive, it's really hard to take care of it. And they feel like it might be getting harder and harder in the future, especially with some upcoming proposed legislation, which we'll discuss later. And then from a tenant standpoint, it's just really hard to find a place to live in this state. There are not a lot of units. The units that do exist tend to be on the very high end, and there a lot of the housing, like in much of the country, is concentrated, at least in cities, by a handful of developments. So a lot of people feel like, okay, well, if I don't like this place, where else am I renting? Where else do I go? Oh, if my landlord isn't doing this right, or if I'm being harassed, or, you know, if my neighbor isn't safe. This is where I'm stuck because these are the options I have because of a combination of cost and literal physical living units.
It seems like there is, the legislature perhaps has been thrust into this role of calling balls and strikes, deciding who gets what power in what situations, which is definitely not one that I envy. But it also, because it is such, I'll call it a high stakes game here, both because of the amount of money that is tied up in real estate, right? If you want to own a multi-apartment facility, for example, that doesn't come cheap to own and operate. It comes with a lot of work. But on the other side of that, of course, you have folks who, gosh darn it, they need a place to live. And to your point too, when you get these two camps and you have people jumping into the middle, uh, it's not a great place to be. I know you said that landlords were kind of the jumping off point because we got folks reaching out to us saying, "Hey, we're experiencing these challenges as property managers or as owners." And then you obviously did a wonderful job reaching out and making sure that we're capturing all of these different viewpoints. But what are landlords concerned about? What, my understanding at least is that there were legislative priorities, right? As they're trying to call balls and strikes, as they're trying to decide, how to handle this. Maybe there's a question about who should be handling this in the first place. But clearly, the legislature has jumped in regardless, and they are putting forward proposals. What is getting people worked up about those proposals?
And first, I guess to add another layer that I probably should have said in the last question, housing is not just housing. Housing is workforce. Housing is school budgets. Housing is, police departments. It's local taxes. It's local organizations. And if you're just because a city doesn't have enough housing doesn't mean it can't benefit from more residents. Especially in Connecticut, a lot of people, particularly Democrats, although I've definitely heard Republicans mention this too, um, they tie the housing crisis to this worker shortage we have.
Hmm.
And I can say right now, I do know people in my personal life who've been like, oh, I would have loved to work in this place, but I literally can't find a house.
Hmm.
So there's a lot of elements to take into consideration because it's very easy, I think, to look at this and be like, well, this is the role of the government. And obviously, that's a good thing to consider, but like the government is not just balancing one issue, which leads to the legislation that has really caught my eye personally, and a lot of landlords too. A lot of them were very concerned about this, and um, this is being discussed in the Joint Committee right now, but it's called HB 6889. There's a bit under the end of our story, but what it really is an act concerning evictions for cause.
Hmm.
Um, there are two categories of how you evict a tenant. One is they do something wrong, they violate the contract, they don't pay rent, whatever, and okay, they have to go, or you have to try and get them to go. The other is their lease is up, and they didn't do anything wrong per se, but you want that unit free. Maybe you have issues with that tenant that, you couldn't prove, but they're there, they're causing problems. Maybe you want to develop it. Maybe you just don't want to be a landlord anymore. And so even though this person did nothing wrong, they are still being evicted at the end of their lease, and that's what's called called a just cause eviction. Now, right now, there are a few protected classes in Connecticut who cannot be given just cause evictions, except under specific circumstances like a unit being taken off the market or small housing units. But those are senior citizens, severely disabled people, and their immediate families, if they're often who are caretakers. But there is a movement to expand that definition to include much larger groups of people, and certain proposals, including HB 6889, really want everyone who has lived in a building for at least a year to have that right. So it wouldn't be every renter, it wouldn't be every type of lease. And the idea of that is, you know, you've done nothing wrong. It's you have nowhere to go. Or what if you have nowhere to go? And a lot of the advocates are, you know, very concerned that landlords are just kicking people out and jacking up the price. But from a landlord perspective, well, one, this is your property. This is, you own this. Why is anyone telling you what to do with it? You're not terminating a contract for an employee at the end of it is not considered retaliation.
I
Why
was going
is
to say it
terminating
wouldn't
a
even
lease?
really be terminating a contract because
Yeah,
the contract has expired, right? I mean,
exactly. Yeah.
I see that frustration. So that's
Yeah.
raised eyebrows, right? Landlords are
Yeah.
frustrated about that. I also want to put in a plug here briefly because you've talked about the workforce and the supply issue. I'll throw out there that Catherine Revelo wrote about this back in December about, the licensing law issue, which is, hey, we wish we had more housing. Okay, well, there are a lot of barriers to actually building that housing because contractors are forced to have certain hiring requirements and apprenticeship requirements that's prevent, these ratios that are preventing them from actually doing the work to fix the problem. So, not to overplug every investigation we've ever written, for sure, though of course you should read all of our stuff. But I guess just to point out again, this isn't a one-off flash in the pan. This isn't something that is like, oh, we need to deal with it in early 2025. This is something that has been building and building and building, and now the pressure has just really escalated.
Yeah.
On
Just
the other
another
side of
plug
that,
for
oh, yeah,
Ratian.
yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
It is the I don't want to say strangely, it is the most relevant investigation I have read in a long time. I don't know, I didn't expect this, but I feel like every week I'm going back to it. I'm like, this thing I didn't think was related is so important. Like, I need to
Yeah,
understand this. So everyone should read it. I promise. It might sound strange, but like that impacts your life in ways you wouldn't even realize.
for sure. Yeah,
Yeah.
I think that's a really good point about our journalism generally. I am consistently surprised by how intertwined all of these topics are. I mean, literally from trash to renewable energy to construction to housing to, I mean, everything dovetails. And partially it's because it's a small state, but also because of the way that Connecticut's laws are structured, they've created interreliance and they've created ripple effects where you do one thing and it has downstream effects elsewhere. um, I don't want to lose this thread too
Sorry.
because we talk no, you're good, you're good. I just want to make sure because you talked about some of the frustrations that the landlord side of this has, but on the other side of it, as you did a wonderful job talking to tenants and people who they want these extra protections. They don't want a landlord to be able to uh, not renew a lease. I'm not sure if that's exactly the right verbiage, but they're pushing for these ideas. They want legislative action to say, no, I want to continue living here after my lease has ended. What is the argument on that side of the debate?
That one is based on my conversations. I mean, look, if I'll be frank, on both sides of it's not the aisle because these aren't politicians, but like I don't know, on both sides of the industry, the renters and the tenants, there is a lot of hostility. If you get down into the weeds of it, like landlords I spoke to when I asked about evictions, the first thing I heard was like horror story after horror story. And they're like, most people are good people who just can't pay rent because the economy is hard, because they've lost jobs, because I didn't want to, but I had to raise this, et cetera, et cetera. And on the other side, like, I think a lot of tenants advocates just want to see people housed, especially in cold months in this state, you know? And they see it as a form of background retaliation, where you can do
Background
nothing wrong.
retaliation. Okay.
I
Sorry,
don't
that's an interesting phrase. I don't think I've heard it before.
I don't know if that makes sense. I hope you know what I mean. I hope it's not an existing phrase that actually means something
Well,
else.
elaborate on it a little bit because I'm not sure I have a clear understanding of what is being referenced there.
You could retaliate against a tenant completely legally. If
Mm.
that tenant is advocating for themselves because if their landlord isn't giving them what they need, at the end of the year, they're scared that, if I push too hard, I'll be kicked out.
Gotcha. So some of it is, hey, these landlords are putting a property into disrepair. It's very
Yeah.
difficult to live here. But if I speak up, that no fault eviction or the end of a contract could result in me having to find, there's without a doubt
Yeah.
additional costs that come down when you're doing, needing to find new housing. That's tough.
Yeah.
That takes resources without a doubt.
And then the other thing is there's an argument I've heard been made. Um, I'll say that I'm not an economist. I'm not going to say this is right, this is wrong. The reader or the readers, the viewers, you're very smart. You can form your opinions, you can do your research. I trust you. But one argument I have heard is when you allow landlords to evict people, they're just going to raise the cost of rent, and that's going to make it worse for everyone. And so they shouldn't do it unless they need to. And that's again based on the assumption that, like, people are being evicted for expansions, or not evicted. I mean, maybe that's the legal term, but evicted sounds like you're being kicked out because you did something wrong. And
Non-renewed,
yeah,
perhaps.
their leases are not being renewed
Yeah.
because they want to make the entire market more expensive now. I spoke to small landlords. That's not their intention. They they know that they're gonna have a hard time finding renters if people can't afford rent. But that's not to say that, especially, and this is I'll just say it, I struggle to get the perspective from large landlords. I'm not saying no one does it. I'm not saying if I called the biggest landowning company in the state, they'd be like, oh yeah, totally, that's our job. But I'm not trying to make sweeping characterizations about people's motivations or character, but yeah, there is a concern that every time someone gets pushed out, the rent gets raised and the entire market suffers. And so not only does this person have to struggle to find another place to live, um, they also have to, the entire market gets worse and worse and worse.
I'm gonna try to. I'll find it and maybe I'll link it in the show notes. But my understanding too is that this is particularly interesting in this moment in time because states like New Hampshire have this where you're not allowed to evict people at the end, and they are in the process of getting rid of it. And
Really?
the debates are actually startlingly similar because it's basically the same discussion, but we're kind of seeing it, hey, what does this look like 10 years in the future? And what kind of issues are likely to come up? So I'm not going to talk about all of the details on that, obviously, right now, because it's outside of our scope. But I think it's worth mentioning that, to your point, this is happening in many different states. And, these laboratories of democracy, for lack of a better phrase, perhaps, are worth keeping an eye on generally to make informed decisions. I also want to compliment you on complimenting our readers because you brought up a really important point, which is we trust our readership to get into the weeds. And I think that's part of, one of the reasons that we were created generally is when we sit down and, even through your interview process, I think one of the most important questions that I can ask is, what do you care about? What do you want people to start asking questions about? And why we have a team that is not monolith in our beliefs is because we want our readers to not feel like, hey, we're getting spoon fed something or, there's an agenda. We say internally and actually externally as well, we don't have an agenda. We have a mission to eliminate corruption in the state of Connecticut. And there's a big difference between those two, right? We are not in the business of advocacy. We're in the business of journalism. And I think you also deserve compliments because of what the public said in response to what you wrote. And if it's all right, can we pivot to a little journalism 30,000 foot philosophy here? Uh,
Yes, yes.
so someone wrote a comment on the article itself that says, I want to thank you for your honest reporting, favoring both tenant and landlord. And, they go on to share a little bit about their story and, where they fit into the puzzle. But I think that that is what I love to see as an editor and hopefully what you love to see as a reporter. But I was wondering if you could share a little bit with our audience here. How do you walk that line, especially in what is clearly a emotional, politically charged topic? How do you make sure that you are getting the whole story and allowing and encouraging critical thinking in your readers?
For me, look, I'm human. We all have our biases. I start off obviously with any story doing research. Now this story I started off speaking to whoever I could speak to. It just so happened to be that landlords came forward and were easiest to reach at first. But what I normally do is I do as much reading as I can. I paint a picture of how I think this issue, this market, whatever is going, and then I try to look for the other side.
Hmm.
And then I come back, you know, just immediately so I don't get so deep in the process where I'm like, finally at the end, last 2 weeks, I'm like, oh, finally I get like, this perspective that I never considered or never heard. And then I'm like pulling my hair out because I'm like, is it like I have to change course? So I try from the beginning to always challenge assumptions. Again, for this piece, I started with who got back to me. It just so happened that this was not a side I had heard reported a lot in general.
Mhm.
So, that worked out very well. Um, there's that. And then another thing is I talk to people in my own life. I really think that's important. Because obviously I wouldn't tell them specifics. I don't say like, oh, I'm interviewing John Doe today, and he told me this horrifying, intimate story about this. Like, I don't tell them what the story is, but like, I'll talk to them and they'll be like, yeah, I'm doing a story on evictions. And I am fortunate enough to have a lot of very, very passionate people in my life who have very different philosophies and political beliefs and perspectives and experiences. Um, and they also help kind of keep me in check. I personally have had a huge mixed bag with renters across the country. I've had landlords who I say this honestly, I really feel like they've saved my life. I've had landlords where I'm like, it's been a year, can you please get the rats out of my house? You know?
Yeah.
Um, it's but I speak to people with a diversity of perspectives, and that keeps me grounded. And I do this with all issues too. I do this a lot with my daily stories. Like if I'm on a lunch break, I'll like go, talk to my husband. I'll be like, hey, have you heard of this? He's lived in different places than I have, so he has different perspectives. Or I'll call my dad or my mom or my sister or this guy from college who I haven't spoken to in like 2 years, but like, we always said we'd keep in touch, so why not now?
He's
I
got a
don't
perspective to share, and maybe it'll be useful. So I guess surrounding yourself with curious minds
Yeah.
helps you inspire more curious minds.
There's that, and then also I think I hope this doesn't sound too self-aggrandizing, but I think just as important, maybe I think is just as important to report facts as it is to let people know the context in which they exist. And like my goal isn't to go out and be like, well, no one said the landlord's perspective, so my goal is to highlight the landlord's perspective. Like that's not what I do, but people all have their own views, and it's yeah, be curious, be open, and also just, you know, again, I don't show anyone the story, but like I'll talk to them. I'll be like, oh, I heard this and this in very vague terms and see what's missing. See what questions they ask. Like, why would anyone do this? And be like, well, I actually know why they did that. Maybe I'll add that there. Why would anyone think this? Well, actually, I didn't think it was too important because, we talked so long about this and this stood out to me, but actually, maybe this is what is missing to make things make sense. And a lot of times I'll hear people be like, a lot of times people don't think that, or a lot of times people come to their own conclusions and they'll be like, oh, well, that's not what he said. So being, I'm not, if I published as is and anyone would only get a negative perspective, that's not fair?
For sure. I'm a big fan of the phrase check your premise, right?
Yes.
It helps us think through problems. And this applies whether you're writing a story or editing a story, or frankly, if you're just out in the world, checking your premise, developing those skills. I mean, I think journalism has a unique spot in that when you're reading something, and even when you're reading us, I want you to read our work with skepticism. I want you to read our work like it's not the end all be all. Because as you said, we're human, and we try to acknowledge that right up front, right? Journalism by humans for humans. It's everywhere on our social media. I think it's our banner picture right now in a bunch of places. But what that means, it can be interpreted in many ways. But we want to acknowledge our own imperfections, but we want to ultimately act in service to our readers, which is just a vital part of what successful journalism looks like. If we aren't providing value, we shouldn't be in business. And that we want to acknowledge that. That's it at the end of the day. So um, we're running low on time here. So I just want to first, again, encourage everyone to go and read this piece. We can talk about it from the 30,000-foot level, but the devil's in the details. And if you want to understand what's going on with evictions and the legislative debates and truly the human element of what's going on here, head over to insideinvestigator.org. This piece is called Evicted. You can find it in the investigations tab if it is not still featured on our homepage by the time you get around to listening to this. And finally, I will throw out, as always, we are a nonprofit, which means 100% of our revenue comes from people who voluntarily give to support our mission. It is a core part of who we are. And as I alluded to, right, we are able to do this only by providing value and acting in service to our readers to help them be more informed, to help them inspire critical thinking, to ultimately root out corruption. That's going to help human flourishing. And that's just a really cool thing to be able to work on every single day. If you similarly believe that's important, head over to insideinvestigator.org, hit that donate button in the top right-hand corner or in the hamburger drop-down menu if you're on mobile. And we would love to have you join the ranks of our hundreds of supporters who donate to make this possible. We will be back in 2 weeks. And until then, be well, stay safe, and stay informed.